a mob boss, a starving girl, and a betrayal 15 years in the making. Kieran Voss didn't do mercy. Mercy was a weakness that got men buried in concrete. But the night he found her, crouched under a frozen bridge, shielding her dying brother with nothing but her own body heat and sheer rage, something cracked open inside his chest that he couldn't name and couldn't close. She looked up at him like she'd already decided she wasn't afraid to die. He'd faced armies, courtrooms, assassins. Nothing had ever stopped him cold like a 9-year-old girl's eyes. This is the story of how she saved him back. If this story already has you hooked, hit like right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. The cold that night was the kind that didn't just bite. It got inside you, found the wet spaces between your bones, and stayed there. The city of Velmore had been drowning in freezing rain for 3 days straight, and the river running beneath the Dunmore Bridge had turned the color of old iron. Nobody came down here after dark. Not beat cops, not junkies desperate enough to sleep in open air, not even the street preachers who considered every gutter a potential pulpit. The underside of Dunmore Bridge was a place the city had simply decided not to see, and for years, that arrangement had suited everyone just fine. Kieran Voss stepped out of the black SUV with his collar up and his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the bridge like it owed him something. He was 51 years old, 6'2", the kind of broad that came from decades of work rather than vanity. The shoulders of a man who'd carried heavy things for a long time, the jaw of a man who hadn't smiled in so long the muscles had probably forgotten the motion. His face was a record of damage, a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a nose that had been broken and reset badly enough to sit slightly left of center, eyes the color of deep water, gray-green and utterly still, the way the surface of a lake goes still right before something surfaces from below. 2 of his men flanked him, their breath coming out in white plumes. Behind them, the SUV's engine idled low. Kieran hadn't intended to stop here. He'd been on his way back from a sit-down in the warehouse district, a conversation with a shipping broker who'd skimmed $20,000 off a container manifest and needed to understand, clearly and without further ambiguity, why that was not going to happen again. The conversation had gone long. The broker had cried. Kieran had waited for him to finish, explained the mathematics of the situation one final time, and left without raising his voice. He never raised his voice anymore. He'd learned decades ago that silence was more frightening than volume, and he'd refined that lesson until it was something close to an art form. He told his driver to take the river route back. Then he'd seen the fire. Not a fire exactly. A small heap of burning cardboard stuffed into a cracked oil drum, 20 feet below the bridge's edge, throwing orange light against the concrete pylons. In that light, crouched over the drum with her back to the road, was a child. "Stop," Kieran had said. His driver had stopped. That was 11 minutes ago. Now Kieran stood at the bottom of the embankment, his leather shoes soaking through on the frozen mud, and looked at the situation laid out before him with the same flat assessment he gave to everything, cataloging, calculating, deciding. There were 2 of them. The girl was older, maybe 8, maybe 9, small even for that, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up so many times the cuffs had become thick rings of fabric around her narrow wrists. She had dark hair plastered to her face by the rain. She was crouched with her back to him, and she was talking, low and steady, to the boy lying on the ground behind her. The boy was maybe 5. He was wrapped in what appeared to be a hotel curtain, floral pattern, deep burgundy, the kind of thing stripped from a room in a hurry. He was shaking. Even from 15 feet away, even over the sound of the rain in the river, Kieran could hear it. The shallow, rapid, wet-sounding breaths that meant the cold had already gotten deep into his chest. The girl heard the footsteps. She moved fast, faster than Kieran expected, spinning and planting herself between him and the boy in a single motion, both arms out, chin up. Her eyes were very dark and very direct, and the look in them was not fear. It was something more complicated than fear. It was the look of someone who had already done their math on the situation and concluded that they were very likely going to lose but had decided to do it standing up. In her right hand, she was holding a piece of broken glass wrapped at one end with a strip of cloth. Not a knife. Not a weapon by any meaningful adult measure, but she was holding it like she meant it. Kieran stopped walking. His men moved to step forward and he raised one hand, not dramatically, just a slight lift from the coat pocket. and they stopped. He looked at the girl. She looked at him. "Easy," Kieran said. "Don't come closer." Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be, scratchy at the edges. She'd probably been crying earlier, or coughing, or both, but the core of it was solid. "I'm not going to touch you." "You're not going to touch him." She didn't move the glass piece, didn't lower it. Her arms were trembling, but he recognized the difference between trembling from cold and trembling from adrenaline. This was both. "What's wrong with him?" Kieran asked. "None of your business." "He's sick." "I know he's sick. I said none of your business." Kieran studied her for a moment. Behind him, one of his men, Marco, cleared his throat with the particular frequency that meant he thought this was taking too long. Kieran ignored it. "How long has he been like that?" The girl's jaw tightened. For just a fraction of a second, the armor slipped. He saw it, the flash of something desperate and exhausted behind the defiance, and then it locked back into place. 4 days, she said. 4 days. Kieran looked at the boy. The curtain had soaked through in several places. His face was too pale and too flushed at the same time. The contradiction of a body fighting a fever it was losing. "Where are your parents?" Silence. "Anyone looking for you?" Nothing. "Okay." Kieran reached into his coat and produced a folded stack of bills. He didn't count it out. There was no need. He knew exactly how much was in every pocket on his person at any given time. It was $1,200, and he held it out toward her. "Take this. Get him somewhere warm. There's a clinic on Hadley Street. They don't ask for ID." "I don't want your money." He paused. "Excuse me? You heard me." She still hadn't lowered the glass. "I don't want money. Money doesn't help tonight. He needs food. Real food. Warm food. Tonight. Right now. Money doesn't do anything right now in the middle of the night in the freezing cold with nowhere to go." Kieran looked at the money in his outstretched hand. Looked at her. Looked at the money again. He couldn't remember the last time someone had told him no. He genuinely could not recall it. Not directly. Not this cleanly. Not standing this close. "You want food," he said. "I want food for him. I don't care about me." "What's his name?" Another flicker. Softer this time. "Eli." "What's your name?" She considered whether to answer. He could see the calculation happening, the same way he watched experienced men calculate risk at negotiating tables. The rapid internal weighing of what information costs against what withholding it costs. "Elena," she said. "Elena." He said it once, like he was deciding whether it fit. "I'm going to send one of my men to get food. Hot food. Right now. Not a trick. Not a condition. He comes back, you take it, we leave." "And what do you want for that?" "Nothing." Nobody gives away nothing. He almost said something then, something flat and honest about what he was and what his life had looked like for the past 30 years, and how he'd arrived at a bridge in the freezing rain at 11:45 at night to stand in front of a girl with a piece of glass held together with a rag. He didn't. Instead, he said, "Smart. You're right to think that. I'm not a good man, Elena. I'm going to tell you that straight because you're clearly not an idiot and you'll figure it out anyway. But I'm also not going to hurt you or your brother. And right now, those two things can both be true at the same time." She stared at him. The rain fell. Eli coughed, a wet, pulling, terrible sound. And the girl didn't move, but something moved through her face, fast and involuntary, like a wave crossing the surface of water. "Marco," Kieran said, without looking away from Elena. "Boss? There's a 24-hour place on Crane Street. Hot soup, bread, whatever they have that's warm. Get enough for 2. Go now." A pause. Then footsteps retreating up the embankment. Elena hadn't lowered the glass. Kieran turned and walked to the far side of the oil drum and sat down on a concrete block, heavily, because his knee had been a problem for 6 years and the cold made it worse, and pulled out a cigarette. He lit it. He didn't offer her one. He looked at the river. She watched him for a long time. Eventually, she lowered the glass. She didn't put it down. She kept it in her hand, but she sat back on her heels, put her other hand on Eli's forehead, and exhaled a breath that had probably been locked in her chest for a while. "He needs a doctor," Kieran said, to the river rather than to her. "I know. Not the clinic. The clinic is fine for cuts and sprains. That cough..." He stopped. Started again. "He needs a real hospital. Hospitals ask for names, for parents, for insurance, for... I know people at Meridian General, Kieran said. They won't ask. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had weight in it. She was processing this, he could tell, weighing it with the same sharp, exhausted intelligence she'd been applying to every sentence he'd said since he walked down the embankment. Why? She said. Not a question, really. More like a challenge she was laying on the table between them. Kieran smoked. Because he sounds like he's got bilateral pneumonia, and if he doesn't get antibiotics in the next 24 hours, it's going to stop being a hospital problem. That's not what I asked. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not the threat assessment he'd done when he walked up. Not the calculation of what she needed and how to supply it. He looked at her the way he hadn't looked at anything in a very long time. Like it mattered what was there. I don't know, he said. And that was the truth, which surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Marco came back 40 minutes later with 2 large containers of beef soup, a half loaf of bread, and because Marco had 3 kids of his own and certain instincts that 16 years of working for Kieran Voss hadn't entirely killed, a small bag of oranges. Elena fed Eli first. She was methodical about it, broke the bread into small pieces, tested the soup temperature with her own wrist the way someone had probably taught her once, worked patiently through the boy's weak protests when he said he wasn't hungry. She got most of the first container into him before he fell asleep against her shoulder. Then, and only then, she ate, crouched in the dirt next to the oil drum, and she ate like someone who was very hungry but had learned not to show it. Kieran watched her and did not comment. He'd finished his cigarette and sat with his hands resting on his knees. "Will you let me take him to the hospital?" he asked, when she'd finished. She looked at Eli sleeping against her. The war she was fighting with herself was visible on her face. He'd have found it easier to watch if she'd hidden it better. That was the thing about her. She was working so hard to be armored, and the armor was real, and it was formidable, and he respected it. But underneath it, the fear for the boy was utterly unguarded, and the contrast between those two things was almost unbearable to look at. "If anything happens to him," she said, "if anyone at that hospital, I'll be there," Kieran said. "The whole time. Nobody touches him without your say." Another long silence. "Okay," she said, very quietly. He stood. His knee objected. He straightened anyway and called his driver and gave the address of Meridian General, and then he looked back at Elena, who was carefully lifting Eli without waking him, and he stood there with an odd, suspended feeling in his chest that he did not have a name for and hadn't needed a name for in many years. He reached down to help her with the boy's weight. She let him, which cost her something. He could tell. She let him anyway. They rode to the hospital in the back of the SUV, Elena rigid in her seat with Eli's head in her lap, her hand resting flat on his chest like she was monitoring each breath personally. She didn't speak. Kieran didn't speak. Marco in the front seat stared very carefully out the window. The doctors at Meridian General asked no questions of the children. They asked no questions of Kieran either, because the man who ran that hospital's fundraising committee had been accepting certain financial courtesies from Kieran Voss for 9 years, and that was the kind of relationship that produced expedient silence. Eli was admitted. Bilateral pneumonia, as Kieran had suspected. The doctor who briefed him afterward used the phrase, "another 12 hours," in a way that made clear what another 12 hours of bridge sleeping in freezing rain would have produced. Elena heard it. She was standing in the hallway outside the room with her arms crossed, and she heard another 12 hours, and her face went through something. Grief and relief in the same instant, a collision so fast and so violent that she had to look at the wall until it passed. Kieran stood beside her. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. After a while she said, without looking at him, "Thank you." He nodded. "That doesn't make me trust you." "I know." She finally looked at him then, studying his face with those dark, direct eyes, conducting some kind of internal audit. "What do you actually want?" He thought about lying. He had very good lies, finely constructed, deployed without effort. He'd been lying in various ways for 30 years, and he was extremely accomplished at it. But standing in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m. with the smell of antiseptic in the air and a child who almost died in the room behind them, the lies felt distant. Like tools left in a workshop he wasn't sure he was going back to. "I don't know yet," he said. That was the second honest thing he'd said to her in one night. He suspected that was already some kind of record. She held his gaze. Then she looked away, back toward the room where Eli was sleeping in a real bed for the first time in what he guessed was months. "He's all I have," she said. The words landed on Kieran like something physical. He didn't react. He had spent decades making sure that nothing landed on him in any visible way, but he felt it. The specific weight of a sentence spoken by someone who has done their accounting and arrived at the number 1. He understood that number. He lived inside it. He had chosen it, at great cost and over many years, because one was easier to protect than many. Or so he'd told himself. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll have someone bring you clothes in the morning." She looked at him with profound suspicion. "Or not," he said. "Whatever you want. I'll tell the nurses you can stay." He turned and walked down the corridor. At the far end, before he pushed through the exit door, he stopped. He didn't turn around, but he stopped. He stood there for what was, by his own internal count, approximately 8 seconds, which was 7 seconds longer than he had stood still, without purpose, anywhere in recent memory. Then he walked out. The black SUV pulled into traffic on Meridian Avenue, and Kieran sat in the back seat with his hands flat on his thighs and looked at the city through the rain-streaked window and thought about a 9-year-old girl with a piece of broken glass and a voice that didn't shake. Eli Cross died on the 4th day. Not from the pneumonia. They'd gotten ahead of that. It was his heart, which had a defect that nobody had known about because nobody had taken him to a doctor in the past 2 years, and which the pneumonia had simply pushed past its limit. The attending physician used phrases like underlying condition and could not have been predicted, and Kieran stood in the hallway and let them fall on him and said nothing. Elena had been in this room. She'd been holding Eli's hand. Kieran didn't go in. He stood outside the glass window and watched her face in the moment she understood what was happening, watched the bottom fall out of it, watched everything go very still and then shatter. And then he turned and walked to the end of the corridor and stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling and breathed through it. He had ordered the deaths of men. He had watched violence of varieties that would make ordinary people stop being able to sleep. He had assembled his own life around the premise that grief was a structural weakness to be engineered out, that attachment was a liability, that caring about the outcome of something beyond your control was the specific failure mode that got men killed. He stood in that corridor for 40 minutes. When Elena came out, she was not crying. Her face was the face of someone who had done all the crying there was to do in a particular quantity of time, and had now moved somewhere beyond it. The gray, stripped-down country, past grief that people who have lost things early in life sometimes learn to inhabit. She looked at Kieran. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. She said nothing for a while. Then, "You couldn't have known." "No, it wasn't." She stopped. Tried again. Stopped. Shook her head once, a small, tight motion. "It's not your fault." He wasn't sure if she believed that. He wasn't sure he believed it. He had been turning the mathematics over since the doctor spoke, running the calculation backward. If he'd stopped the car 20 minutes sooner, if he'd taken them to the hospital immediately instead of going back for food, if he'd noticed the fire from the bridge an hour earlier. "Elena." She looked at him. He had not planned what he said next. He had not deliberated it, or calculated it, or constructed it the way he constructed everything else in his life. It came out of whatever had cracked open inside his chest at the bridge, and still had not closed. "I'd like you to come stay with me," he said. "Not temporarily. I have room. I have—" He stopped. Started again, because it mattered to him suddenly that this came out right, and he was very out of practice with things mattering that way. "I have more than I know what to do with, and you have nothing. That arithmetic doesn't work for me." She stared at him. "You can leave whenever you want," he said. "Any day, any time, no conditions. But you need a place to sleep that doesn't have a river under it, and I have 17 rooms, and one of them has a lock on the inside." The silence stretched. Outside the hospital window, Velmore's light shimmered in the rain. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know enough. You know I held a piece of glass at you." "Yeah." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "I know that." She looked at him for a very long time with those dark, calculating eyes, and he let her look, because she'd earned it, and because whatever she decided was going to be real, and he had been surrounded by false things for long enough that real ones had started to matter to him in ways he hadn't expected. One lock on the inside, she said. One lock. Your choice when it's open or closed. Another silence, shorter this time. Okay, she said. It was the same word she'd said in the bridge, when she'd let him carry Eli to the car. But it was a different weight. It had more inside it. He could feel that, and it unsettled him in a way he decided not to examine right now, because the car was waiting and the night was late, and there were things ahead of him that he wasn't sure he was equipped for. He didn't know yet that he was right about that. He didn't know that the man who would sit in his house every day for the next 16 years, calm, unassuming Damien Vale, the one person Kieran trusted without qualification, had been watching from across the street that evening, had seen the SUV stop, had noted the hospital, had already begun running his own calculations about what a girl with nothing and a mob boss with everything might eventually mean for the balance of power inside an empire that one of them had decided, somewhere in the back of a black car on a rainy night, he might finally want to hand down. Elena Cross stepped through the hospital's sliding doors into the cold Velmore night, and Kieran Voss walked beside her, and neither of them saw the black sedan parked under the street lamp or the man behind its wheel, watching with the patient, unreadable expression of someone who has just identified a problem and has already started thinking about how to solve it. If part 1 already has you gripped, the city in the comments, right now. Let me know where you're watching from. Part 2 is where things get darker, and the man Elena should have feared most was the one smiling at her across the dinner table. The mansion on Aldrich Hill was not the kind of place that welcomed people. It tolerated them. It sat back from the road behind a gate of black iron, 3 stories of pale stone that had been built in another era by someone with more money than warmth and had never fully recovered from its original intentions. The grounds were immaculate. Kieran paid people to keep them that way. But there was nothing soft about the immaculateness. The hedges were cut to angles. The gravel driveway was raked to a consistency that looked almost aggressive. Even the light that came through the tall windows in the evening had a quality to it, gray and measured, like the house itself was deciding how much to let in. Elena Cross stood at the front door on a Tuesday morning in early March and looked at it the way she'd looked at Kieran at the bridge, like she was doing math on it, running the numbers on what it would cost her. She was wearing the clothes she'd had on at the hospital. Nobody had brought the promised items, which was not a failure of intent but of execution. Kieran had told Marco to arrange it, and Marco had relayed it to someone else, and that someone else had selected things that were entirely wrong. The kind of wrong that could only happen if the person selecting them had never once in their life been responsible for a child. There was a bag on the step beside her with a single change of clothes in it and a toothbrush still in its packaging. Kieran opened the door himself, which surprised her. She'd expected staff. There was staff. She'd learned that later. A housekeeper named Agnes who moved through the rooms like water finding its level, quiet and efficient and almost invisible. But he'd opened the door himself. He looked at her, at the bag, at the clothes. Marco, he said, not loudly, just toward the interior. I'll handle it, she said. The clothes are fine. I'll handle it. She picked up the bag and looked at him. Are you going to make me stand here, or can I come in? He stepped aside. She walked in. The entrance hall was larger than the underside of Dunmore Bridge, which was the measuring unit her brain immediately and involuntarily applied to it. Dark wood floors, a staircase that curved up to the second level with a banister that caught the gray morning light. Nothing on the walls that wasn't deliberate. A few paintings, landscapes, the kind selected to fill space rather than communicate anything. A side table with a crystal bowl that held nothing. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking inventory. It's a lot of house, she said. Yes. Do you actually live in all of it? No. Which parts? He paused as if the question had required actual consideration. The kitchen, my office, the back room on the second floor. That's 3 rooms. Yes. Out of, 17. She looked at the staircase. Okay, she said, for the 3rd time in 24 hours, with the 3rd completely different weight inside it. This one meant, I'm going to need time to understand what I've walked into, and I'm going to need you to give me that time without demanding anything from me while I do it. He seemed to understand that, which surprised her almost as much as him opening his own door. Agnes showed her to a room on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor, with a window that looked out over the back garden, and a radiator that actually worked, and a bed with a mattress so deep that Elena sat on the edge of it for a full 30 seconds just processing the sensation. There was a lock on the inside of the door. A simple thing. a sliding bolt. Nothing dramatic, but it was there exactly as he'd said it would be, and she slid it across and then back and then across again, testing it, and then she sat on the floor with her back against the door and her knees pulled up to her chest and didn't move for a long time. She didn't cry. She'd finished crying in the hospital, at least for now, in that numb, clinical way that grief sometimes enforces. The body running out of the specific chemical that produces tears and simply shutting the mechanism off until it can rebuild supply. She sat on the floor and breathed and looked at the room and thought about Eli, because thinking about him hurt, and she didn't want to stop hurting yet, because the hurting meant she was still paying attention, still honoring what he'd been. He had been 5 years old. He had laughed at things that weren't funny just because laughing felt good. He had been afraid of birds, specifically pigeons, specifically the way they bobbed their heads, which he described as wrong. He had eaten crackers in a particular order, always the broken ones first, for reasons he was unable to explain. He had called her Lena because Elena was too many sounds for him when he was tired. She sat on the floor of the room on Aldrich Hill and thought about every specific thing he had been, one by one, carefully, and she kept them. Damien Vale came to dinner on the third evening. She didn't know who he was yet. She came downstairs because Agnes had knocked and said dinner was ready, and Elena had discovered over 3 days that she was hungry in a way that went beyond the physical. Hungry in some cellular way that the bridge years had produced, a deep animal hunger that proper meals were only beginning to address. And she was not going to decline food on any basis that wasn't life or death. The dining room held a table that seated 12. 3 places were set at one end. Kieran was already seated. Across from him, relaxed in the chair as if he'd been relaxed in it 1,000 times before, was a man Elena hadn't seen in the house previously. He was around 45. Medium height, lean, the kind of lean that was more about efficiency than exercise. Brown hair going silver at the temples. A suit that fit him in a way that suggested it had been made for him specifically rather than adjusted. His face was the kind of face that was easy to look at because it offered nothing threatening. Even features, a measured mouth, eyes that were warm in a way that registered as immediately trustworthy. Elena's stomach tightened the moment she saw him. She could not have explained why. She filed it, the way she'd learned to file unexplained physical responses, under things to think about later, and sat down. "Elena," Kieran said, "this is Damien Vale. He works with me." Damien smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without being obvious about the practice. "Kieran's told me about you," he said. "I'm glad you're here. He talks about me to people?" She looked at Kieran. "Once," Kieran said. Damien laughed. Easy, unforced. "He said you held a piece of glass at him under the bridge and didn't blink. I told him most men I know would have had a harder time than he did." Elena looked at Damien. "Most men aren't most men when they're 9 years old and alone," she said. "It's not the same skill set." A small silence. Damien held her gaze and then inclined his head, a concession. "Fair point," he said. Agnes served soup. Kieran ate with the focused efficiency of a man for whom food was fuel rather than pleasure. Damien ate with the deliberate enjoyment of a man who wanted you to watch him being at ease. Elena watched them both and ate and said nothing further. After dinner, Damien and Kieran went to the back room Kieran used as an office. The door closed. Elena went upstairs, lay on the bed, and stared at the ceiling and tried to locate the specific thing about Damien Vale that had caused the tightening in her stomach. She couldn't name it. It wasn't anything he'd said. It wasn't his face or his voice or his smile. None of those alone. It was something in the combination, a quality she kept reaching for and failing to articulate, like a word in a language she almost but didn't quite speak. She was 9 years old. She filed it. She went to sleep. The months passed the way months do when you're being held in place by extraordinary circumstances. Faster and stranger than you expect, each week compressing into a series of specific images rather than a continuous narrative. Elena enrolled in school through channels Agnes managed without asking Elena to explain anything about her previous living situation. She was placed 2 years behind her age group because her formal education had gaps large enough to drive something through, and she worked through those gaps with the same silent, furious efficiency she applied to everything, and by the end of the first year she'd been moved twice and was sitting in rooms with students 3 years older than her. Not because anyone was trying to impress anyone, but because the alternative was watching her not be challenged, which distressed her in a visible physical way that Agnes reported back to Kieran. Kieran responded by getting her books. Not school books, those she had, but books in general, cases of them, histories and legal texts and biographies and whatever the person he delegated the task to thought a child might want to read. Most of them were wrong. She kept the legal texts and 2 of the biographies and left the rest on the shelf, arranged by height because it made her feel better to arrange things. She and Kieran existed in the house in adjacent orbits. They ate dinner together most nights. Not always. He traveled and she was not told where or why, and she did not ask because she was building the database of what was safe to ask before she started spending from it. They spoke. Carefully at first, in short exchanges that had the quality of 2 people testing ice, each sentence placed down and waited before the next one was added. She asked him questions that were precise and unanswerable. Why do people obey you? What does it cost? Is there a version of what you do that doesn't end with someone getting hurt? He didn't give her easy answers, which was how she came to trust him in the first place. Not because his answers were good, but because he didn't perform goodness at her. He said hard things plainly. She respected that. Damien Vale came to the house on Aldrich Hill approximately once a month, sometimes more. He was always exactly the same, smooth, present, warm in that immediate and therefore slightly inexplicable way. He always acknowledged Elena first when he arrived, which she understood was a performance of respect designed to communicate to Kieran that he valued what Kieran valued. She understood it as a performance because she had learned, in the spaces between the bridge and the dining room table, to read the difference between the way people treated you when you mattered to them and the way they treated you when you were a variable in someone else's equation. She mattered to Kieran, she was a variable to Damien. She told Kieran this when she was 11. They were in the kitchen, one of the 3 rooms he actually inhabited, and she was doing homework at the table while he made coffee with the particular grim focus he applied to the task, as if the coffee machine were a negotiation partner. She looked up from her textbook and said, "I don't trust Damien." He turned, coffee still in hand. "Why?" "He looks at you the way men look at something they want to take." Kieran's face didn't change, but he set the coffee mug down, which was movement, and he looked at her for a moment before he said, "What do you know about the way men look at things they want to take?" "I lived under a bridge," she said. "I know what want looks like when it's trying not to show." He was quiet for a moment. "Damien's worked for me for 12 years. Okay? He's the only man I trust without conditions." "Okay? You don't think that counts for something?" She looked at him with her dark, direct eyes. "I think trust is something you decide to extend before you have the evidence not to. And I think by the time you have the evidence not to, you've usually already lost something." Kieran looked at her for a long time. There was something happening in his face that he wasn't letting out. She could see the weight of it behind his eyes, the way a deep current shows itself in surface movement. "You're 11, he said. "So?" He picked up his coffee. "Go do your homework." She went back to her homework. But she'd watched his shoulders when he turned away, and they were not as settled as they'd been when he came into the kitchen, and she filed that too. She was 12 when she first saw one of Kieran's men come home carrying someone else. 2 of his crew brought a man named Rice through the back entrance of the house at 1 in the morning. She heard the door. She always heard the doors. She slept with a kind of surface attention that never fully let go. And she came to the top of the stairs in the dark and looked down and watched them carrying him through toward the ground floor medical room that she hadn't known existed until that moment. Reese was one of Kieran's drivers. He was 29. He had a daughter whose photo was on his phone, which he'd shown Elena once when she'd asked. He was being carried because he couldn't walk, which appeared to be connected to the fact that his left leg was not at an angle legs were meant to be at. She stood at the top of the stairs and watched. Kieran came through from his office, took one look at Rice, and started giving instructions in a voice that was very quiet and very specific and left no space for misunderstanding. Elena went back to her room. She lay on her bed. She was not afraid of what she'd seen. She was not afraid of much by this point, which was either an achievement or a damage, she hadn't decided. But she was something. She was awake in a way that had thoughts in it. She knocked on the door of Kieran's office at 2:30 in the morning. He opened it. He had blood on his shirt. Not much, but some, a dark smear on the left cuff. He looked at her without expression. "Who did that to him?" she asked. "People I'm handling." "Are you going to hurt them back?" "That's not your concern." Will it make Rice's leg work again? A pause. No. Then what does it accomplish? It accomplishes, he said, in a voice that had developed an edge, that nobody thinks they can do it again. Does it? Or does it just mean next time they do it to someone else? Kieran stared at her. She stared back. Go to bed, Elena. I'm going, she said. And then from the hallway, not looking back. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I don't know that you're right, and I think you don't either, and I think you're smart enough to know you don't. She heard him exhale behind her. She went back to her room. He did not come to breakfast the next morning. He rarely did. But Agnes told her without being asked that Rice's leg was going to heal and that the people responsible were being addressed. And the way Agnes said addressed, in the same tone she used when she said she was seeing to a stain on the upholstery, told Elena all she needed to know about the method. She ate her breakfast. She thought about things. She was 12 years old and she was living in the house of a man who operated by a specific moral system that she did not accept and could not dismantle, and was not entirely sure she should try to dismantle. And the tension of that, of loving someone whose methods you refuse to endorse, was something she was going to have to learn to carry. She began learning it that morning. She never fully finished. She was 15 when she started researching law. Not because anyone suggested it. Kieran certainly didn't. He avoided discussions of legal systems with the instinctive caution of a man who had several reasons to. It came from a book she found in the third-floor library, which was not one of Kieran's 3 rooms, and therefore existed in a kind of neutral domestic space that nobody claimed but nobody cleared out either. The book was a primer on criminal defense, basic and old, the spine cracked to a specific page someone had stopped at years ago and never returned to. She read it in 3 hours. She went back the next day and read the books around it. She started requesting specific texts from Agnes, who requested them from the person who ordered books, who was mildly bewildered but compliant. She understood, in the way she understood things that were going to be important, not suddenly, but accumulating, that law was the structure inside which men like Kieran operated, not as a constraint they obeyed, but as a landscape they navigated. And that understanding the landscape gave you power over it. And that power over it was the only kind that didn't require you to hurt someone. Damien Vale found her in the library one evening when she was 16. She heard his footsteps and identified them by their quality before she looked up. He had a very specific kind of footfall, even pressured, unhurried, the walk of a man who never needed to be anywhere in a hurry because he'd already arranged for everywhere to wait. Good book? He asked. Case studies, she said without looking up. International financial law. Ambitious. Or just interesting. He sat down in the chair across the table from her with the ease that was his constant default mode, his particular form of claiming space. Kieran must be pleased, he said. A lawyer in the family. She looked up then. I'm not in the family, she said. I live here. Damien smiled. There's a difference? Yes. She went back to her book. What do you need from the library? A pause. I was just looking for you, actually. Why? Kieran's asked me to. If Kieran wants to talk to me, Kieran will talk to me, she said. She turned a page. He's capable. Another pause. Longer this time. She kept her eyes on the page and monitored him in her peripheral vision. The slight shift in his posture, the recalibration, the smile that remained on his face, but relocated slightly, like a mask being readjusted. You've never liked me much, he said. I don't know you well enough to not like you. You've known me for 7 years. I've seen you at dinner for 7 years. That's not the same thing. She looked up. Is there something I can actually help you with, Damien? He held her gaze. The warmth in his eyes was still there. It was always there. But underneath it, for just a moment, she saw something else. Something that assessed her the way a person assesses an obstacle. Then it was gone, and the warmth settled back into place, and he smiled and stood and said, no, nothing. He'd find Kieran himself. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Then she sat very still for a moment, her hand flat on the open page of the case study book, her eyes on the middle distance, and she thought, there it is. The thing she'd been trying to name since she was 9 years old, sitting at a dinner table and feeling her stomach tighten. She still couldn't put a word to it, but she'd seen it now clearly, for one unguarded second. And what she'd seen was that Damien Vale looked at the people around Kieran, the people Kieran cared about, the way a chess player looks at pieces on a board, not with hostility, with strategy. She went to Kieran that evening. He was in his office. The door was open, which was not always the case. He was at his desk with papers in front of him and his glasses on. She'd discovered at 13 that he wore reading glasses, which he clearly regarded as a personal failing and tried to accomplish invisibly. And he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "I need you to listen to me about Damien," she said. He took his glasses off, set them down. "Elena, I saw something tonight, in his face, when he thought I wasn't paying attention." She stepped into the office. "I can't prove it. I don't have evidence. I have an instinct that is 7 years old and has never given me a wrong reading on a person, and I am telling you that man is not what you think he is." Kieran looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his most careful one. Not dismissive, not persuaded. The expression of a man running calculations that he didn't entirely share. "What did you see?" he asked. "He looked at me like I was something in his way." Silence. "You've never liked him," Kieran said. "That's not what this is. I'm not saying it's not real to you. I'm saying you've had a bias since the first night he came to dinner, and bias affects perception." "Kieran," she held his gaze. "I am not biased. I am careful. Those are different things, and you know me well enough to know the difference." He did know the difference. She could see that he knew it. She could also see something else. The specific resistance of a man who has built his entire operation around a single trust, who has allowed himself the one luxury of an unconditional reliance, and who is being asked to examine what that reliance has been resting on. "I'll look into it," he said. She waited for more. More didn't come. "That's it?" "That's it." She wanted to push. She was constitutionally built for pushing. She pushed until she hit something real, and she wasn't sure she'd hit something real yet. But she looked at his face and recognized the specific quality of the closing off that was happening, the way he pulled a decision around himself like a coat, and she understood that further pressure tonight would produce resistance rather than movement. "Okay," she said, and then, "Look carefully." She left. She was 17 when she applied to university. Pre-law, a school in the city, one she'd identified 2 years prior as having the best program for what she intended to do with herself. Kieran signed the papers without objection. He came to the open day. He stood in the back of the auditorium in a coat that cost more than most of the other parents' cars, and listened to the dean's address with his arms crossed and his face entirely neutral, and afterward, walking across the campus, he said, "It's a good program. I know. You'll be good at it." "I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "That's not arrogance?" "No, it's accuracy." She looked back at him. "Is there a difference?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Kieran Voss's relationship with smiling remained complicated throughout her entire childhood. A thing that happened but rarely, and always seemed to surprise him slightly when it did. But something adjacent to a smile. Something warm in the neighborhood of it. "No," he said. "I think that's just you being honest." She started university in September. She came home on weekends for the first year, then less, then for dinners and Kieran's birthday in November, which he didn't acknowledge as his birthday, but which she'd discovered via Agnes and marked anyway. She was building something. Her life, her future, the architecture of the person she'd decided to become. And it required distance from Aldrich Hill and everything the house represented, not because she was rejecting it, but because she needed to know who she was when she was somewhere else. During her second year of university, she found the first discrepancy. She wasn't looking for it. She was doing research on corporate structures for a class assignment, tracing the ownership chains of holding companies for an exercise in corporate law, and she pulled a reference that showed up in a secondary source she almost didn't read, and there was a name in it. One of Kieran's import companies, a legitimate business, she'd always understood it to be legitimate. He maintained both kinds, and the legitimate ones were substantial. Listed as a partial owner of a shell entity registered in a jurisdiction known almost exclusively as a vehicle for financial concealment. She read it twice. 3 times. She pulled the secondary source, then the primary, then the registration documents, which were a matter of public record in the jurisdiction in question, and available if you knew which database to search, and she knew which database to search, because she'd spent the past 2 years learning exactly that. The signatory on the founding documents was not Kieran Voss. It was Damien Vale. But the money flowing through was tied to Kieran's operation. Kieran's accounts. Kieran's name in the financial architecture. appearing as the beneficial owner of a chain of transactions that Kieran had not, as far as she could tell, initiated or approved or possibly even known about. She sat in the university library at 11 o'clock at night with the documents on the screen in front of her and felt something very cold and very specific settle into the center of her chest. She had been right. She had been right for 8 years, from a dinner table when she was 9 years old, and Kieran hadn't listened, and now she was looking at the beginning of something that she understood in the part of her brain that had been building toward this moment through 2 years of legal training was not a beginning at all. It was already well underway. She picked up her phone. She stared at Kieran's name in her contacts. She put the phone down. She needed more. She needed to know how far it went before she told him, because if she told him now, with only this, he would act on instinct, which meant violence. And Damien would disappear, and the evidence would disappear with him. And Kieran would be left holding the shell companies with his name on them, and no one left to prove who'd actually built them. She needed to be sure. She needed to be thorough. She needed to be in the precise sense she was training herself for, a lawyer before she was a daughter. She opened a new file on her laptop and began documenting everything she'd found. That was the night the case began. She didn't know yet how long it would take to build. She didn't know yet that Damien had already anticipated someone looking, had already laid additional layers of false documentation, had already, in the patient and methodical way she was only beginning to understand, been constructing a version of events in which Kieran Voss was not the victim of the conspiracy, but its author. She didn't know yet that by the time she found the next document, and the one after that, and traced the money far enough to see the shape of what had been built, Kieran would have been arrested, charged, and arraigned, and would be sitting in a courtroom watching the evidence of a crime he hadn't committed be presented to a jury as his life's work. She found that out 18 months later, on a Tuesday morning, when she got a call from Agnes. Agnes, who never called, who communicated through the house's internal rhythms, through meals and clean rooms, and the particular quiet of a person who kept things running by staying invisible. Agnes, who answered the phone in the kitchen of an empty mansion on Aldrich Hill because Kieran had been taken by federal agents 3 days prior, and she had waited 3 days to call because she was not sure Elena would want to know and was less sure she could bear to be the one to tell her. "Elena," Agnes said, in the careful, flattened voice of someone trying to deliver weight without letting you feel how heavy it is. "You need to come home." Elena was already standing, already reaching for her laptop, already pulling up the court filings she'd learned to access, her hand moving before her brain had finished receiving the sentence, because somewhere in her, in the part that had been filing things for 9 years, keeping a database of every unverifiable instinct and every unexplained document and every moment when Damien Vale's eyes had moved across a room in a way that wasn't quite right, she had already known that this moment was coming. She had just been hoping she'd be ready for it when it arrived. She was not ready. But she picked up the phone and she said, "I'm coming," and she closed the laptop and looked at the files she'd been building for 18 months and understood that whatever she'd been building them toward had just arrived ahead of her. Damien Vale had spent 15 years constructing a trap. Elena Cross had spent 2 building the key. The question, the only question that mattered now, was whether the key was finished. She didn't know yet, and the trial date was in 6 weeks. The drive back to Velmore took 4 hours. Elena drove it alone, which was a choice she made without thinking about it, the specific instinctive choice of someone who needed the contained space of a car and the mechanical requirement of keeping the road in front of her, because if she stopped moving, she was going to have to sit with what she knew, and what she knew was not yet something she could sit with. She'd been in her university apartment when Agnes called. She'd packed in 11 minutes, laptop, the external hard drive with 18 months of documentation, 3 changes of clothes, her legal notebooks, the specific folder she'd been building since the night she found the first shell company. She'd locked the apartment without looking back at it. She'd driven with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and her mind running the case the way she'd been trained to run cases, methodically, forward, building the structure before you started filling it in. Except this case had a variable that no classroom had prepared her for, which was that the defendant was the man who had carried Eli through a hospital door at 2 a.m. and then stood in a corridor for 40 minutes saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She did not think about that. She thought about documents. The federal charges had been filed 6 weeks ago, according to the court records she pulled on her phone at a rest stop outside the city. Money laundering, conspiracy to defraud financial institutions, racketeering. The indictment ran to 47 pages. She read it standing in a gas station parking lot in the cold, her breath coming out in white plumes, scrolling through it with the focused speed of someone who had learned to read legal documents the way other people read messages. Fast. Looking for the structure, annotating in her head. The structure was immaculate. That was the first thing that hit her, before the specific charges. Before the names and the amounts and the jurisdictions, the structure of it was immaculate. The kind of immaculate that took years. The kind of immaculate that came from someone who understood exactly how financial crime investigations worked and had built the evidence trail specifically to survive scrutiny from people who knew what they were looking for. Whoever had constructed this had not been trying to avoid detection. They had been building something that would hold up in court. She drove the remaining 2 hours in a different state of mind than she'd started in. The mansion on Aldrich Hill looked smaller than she remembered, which was not a physical fact, but an emotional one. The house she'd left 3 years ago had been large with the largeness of something she was still learning to navigate, and the house she pulled up to now was just a building, stone and glass and raked gravel, sitting behind its iron gate with the lights on and 2 windows. Agnes opened the door before she reached it. The housekeeper was 62 years old, and she had a face that had been organizing itself around the specific work of not showing things for so long that the effort had become the face, composed, contained, giving away only what was deliberately offered. But she looked at Elena, and her eyes did something, a small, involuntary admission of relief, and she said, "I made food. I'm not hungry. I made food anyway." Elena stepped inside. The entrance hall was exactly as she'd left it. Same floors, same staircase, same empty crystal bowl on the side table. She looked at it all and felt nothing in particular, and then felt, underneath the nothing, something so large she couldn't look at it directly. "Where is he?" she asked. "Remand facility on Pryor Street," Agnes said. "They denied bail. The prosecution argued flight risk." "Of course they did." Elena set her bag down. "He is a flight risk." "He didn't ask for you," Agnes said carefully. "I know. I want to be clear about that. He didn't—" "Agnes, I know." She looked at the older woman. "That's not why I came." She went to the office. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, which meant it was exactly as it had been when they'd taken him, which meant someone had been in this house and gone through this room, and he had not been here to prevent it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the surface of the desk, and at the slightly wrong angle of the chair, and at the drawer that was not quite fully closed, and understood the specific violence of a search warrant in a way that legal training described but didn't convey. She sat down in his chair. She opened her laptop. She connected the external hard drive. She spread her notebooks on the desk in the order she'd developed for them, and she started working. She worked for 11 hours. By 4 in the morning, she had built a clearer picture of what Damien Vale had constructed, and the clearer it became, the colder she felt, the specific cold of someone who has been standing in front of a painting for a long time and has suddenly understood what the painting is actually of. The shell companies were the architecture. She'd found the first one 18 months ago, and she'd found more since, 6 additional entities registered across 4 jurisdictions, each one layered beneath the previous, each one moving money in amounts calibrated to stay below reporting thresholds before aggregating in accounts that, at the top of the chain, bore signatures linked to Kieran Voss. The signatures were forged. She was certain of this. The signature on the founding document she'd found first had a specific inconsistency in the formation of the capital K that appeared nowhere in Kieran's authentic signatures, of which she had 43 samples collected from legitimate business documents over the past year. But the forged signatures were only one layer. The prosecution's case, as she understood it from the indictment, rested on 3 things: the financial records, the testimony of 2 witnesses, and a set of communications, emails and encrypted messages, that had been recovered from a server and attributed to Kieran. She pulled the communications exhibit. It had been included in the disclosure, which meant she had access to it, which meant she could read it. She read it. She read it twice. Then she sat back in Kieran's chair and pressed her palms flat on the desk and breathed through what she was looking at. The messages were not forged, or if they were forged at a level of technical sophistication that would require expertise she hadn't yet located and couldn't immediately counter. They read as authentic, the syntax, the vocabulary, the specific compressed shorthand of someone writing quickly to someone they trusted completely. They discussed transactions. They discussed specific amounts. They discussed, in the elliptical way that people who know each other well discuss things without naming them fully, the movement of money through the shell company architecture, and they were addressed to Damien Vale, which meant they appeared to be Kieran directing Damien, not Damien acting independently, not Damien building his own structure. Kieran instructing, authorizing, overseeing. She understood what this meant. The prosecution wasn't going to argue that Damien was an innocent lieutenant following orders. They were going to argue that Kieran was the architect and Damien the operator, and the communications were the proof of that relationship, which meant her entire case, the one she'd been building for 18 months, the one that traced the financial structure back to Damien, the one that showed the forged signatures and the hidden ownership, that case did not answer the communications. And the communications were the center of the prosecution's evidence. She needed to find out where those messages actually came from. She needed to know if they were fabricated. And if they were, she needed to know how they'd been fabricated. And she needed to know it in a way that could be demonstrated to a court. And she needed to do all of this in 6 weeks. She closed the laptop. She put her head in her hands. She did not cry. She had Kieran's specific incapacity for crying at moments of crisis, which she had absorbed from proximity over years without noticing. But she sat in his chair in his office at 4 a.m. and breathed through the specific arithmetic of the situation. She had 18 months of documentation that was now, in the light of the communications evidence, insufficient. She had 6 weeks. She had no access to the technical expertise required to examine the message metadata. She had no standing in the case because she was not Kieran's attorney of record. He had retained a firm, Marsh and Cahill, who were expensive and competent and who had, based on the court filings she'd read, not yet identified the communications as the critical vulnerability they clearly were. She picked up her phone and called Marsh and Cahill at 4:15 in the morning, left a message that was precise and non-emotional, and made clear exactly who she was and what she had. And then she went upstairs to her old room and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling until it got light. Kieran looked older. She hadn't expected that. She'd known, intellectually, that 3 months in a remand facility while awaiting trial would produce visible effects on a man of 54, and she'd thought she'd prepared for it. She hadn't. He walked into the visitation room and she saw the difference in the way he moved. Not diminished, not defeated, but compressed, like something that has been under pressure long enough to change its density, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest that she couldn't analyze right now. He sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I'm here. Elena, I'm here and I'm not leaving and I need you to talk to me. All of it. Everything you know about the shell companies." He looked at the table. "I don't know anything about the shell companies." "I believe you. Tell me what you do know." "I know Damien handled the legitimate financial operations. He had full authority. I signed documents when he brought them to me." "Which documents?" "Whatever needed signing. I trusted his judgment on the structures." She kept her face neutral. "Did you read them, the documents you signed?" A long pause. "Not always. Not always," she said in the voice she'd been developing in moot court, the voice that didn't judge but made the problem visible. "How often?" "Elena." "How often, Kieran?" He looked at her. "Does it matter now?" "Yes. It matters because the prosecution is going to ask you the same question, and your answer is going to determine whether the jury thinks you were negligent or criminal. There is a significant difference between those two things, and I need to know which one is true before I trusted him." The words came out flat and final, with a particular quality of rawness underneath them that she'd never heard from him before. Not anger. Something worse than anger. The specific, unprocessed quality of a person who has been betrayed by the one unconditional thing they allowed themselves and has not yet found the place inside themselves where that fact can be stored. "I trusted him completely, for 16 years. He was the only—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I trusted him." She watched his face. She let the silence hold for a moment before she spoke again. "The communications," she said. "The messages the prosecution has, emails and encrypted messages between you and Damien, discussing the transactions. Did you send them?" He looked up. "No." "You're certain?" "I'm certain. I don't use email for anything sensitive. I don't put things in writing. That is a rule I have maintained without exception for 30 years. The prosecution is going to say the rules changed. They're going to say you got comfortable. that you trusted Damien enough to put things in writing to him specifically. Then the prosecution is wrong. I know. She leaned forward slightly. I need to prove it. And to prove it, I need access to the metadata on those messages, the technical signature, the server origin, the transmission path. Marsh & Cahill's technical consultant, I don't want you involved in this. She stopped. Excuse me, she said. You heard me. Kieran, you're 20 years old. You're in your second year of university. This case is going to be... He stopped, reorganized. I don't want what this looks like near you. The people involved, the exposure. You don't get to make that decision, she said. I'm the defendant. You are not my father. The words came out before she'd decided to say them, and they landed between them with a specific weight that neither of them had a prepared response to. She watched him absorb it, watched the flicker of something cross his face. Not hurt, not exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it. The specific flinch of a man who has been careful not to claim something and has just had it confirmed that the care was warranted. She let it settle. Then she said more quietly, You're not my father. You're someone I chose to live with, and you're someone I trust. And you're someone who is sitting in a remand facility because a man I told you about when I was 9 years old has spent 15 years building a cage around you. And I am the person who has been documenting that cage for 18 months. And I am the only person in this situation who has both the documentation and the legal training to... She stopped, steadied. You don't get to protect me from this by making decisions without me. We don't do that. The silence in the visitation room was very complete. Kieran sat with his hands flat on the table. He was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen in the kitchen when she was 11. The calculation, the weight of it, the running of something behind his eyes that he didn't fully surface. What do you need? He said. She exhaled once. Access to Marsh & Cahill. Not around them. With them. I want to sit in on the technical review of the communications evidence. I want to present what I found on the shell company chain. And I need Marsh to get an independent forensic analyst on the message metadata before the prosecution can argue chain of custody. I'll call Marsh today. Good. She stood. And Kieran. She waited until he looked at her. You knew. Some part of you knew something was wrong. You told me you'd look into it. I need to know, did you? Did you look and find something and decide not to tell me? The question sat there between them like a thing with edges. He didn't answer immediately. The delay was answer enough in one direction, but she waited for the actual words because she needed the actual words. I found one thing, he said, 2 years ago. An account discrepancy. I brought it to Damien, and he explained it, and the explanation was plausible, and He stopped. I believed him. What was the discrepancy? He described it. She wrote it down. It was one of the transactions she'd already documented, one she'd traced back through 3 shell layers, but she hadn't known Kieran had seen it, hadn't known he'd asked Damien about it directly, which meant Damien had known, 2 years ago, that someone was getting close enough to see the edges of the structure, which meant everything Damien had built in the past 2 years, including the communications evidence, had been built knowing that Kieran had started looking. The communications weren't just fabricated to frame Kieran. They were fabricated specifically to answer the investigation, specifically to create a version of events that would survive scrutiny from someone who already knew the financial structure. Damien hadn't been panicking. He'd been anticipating. She drove back to Aldrich Hill with this knowledge sitting in the passenger seat and tried to determine what it meant for her timeline and her evidence and the 6 weeks she had left. And by the time she reached the Iron Gate, she had understood something that changed the shape of everything. She was not ahead of Damien. She had never been ahead of him. He had known she existed, known she was building a case, known the approximate contours of what she'd found. And he had built his fabrication to specifically neutralize it. The communications evidence wasn't a separate attack on Kieran. It was a direct response to her investigation. It was designed to make her evidence look like the incomplete picture and the prosecution's evidence look like the complete one. She went inside. She went to the office. She sat down at the desk and opened the laptop and looked at the 18 months of work spread across the screen. Then she looked at the communications exhibit again, carefully. With this new understanding in place, looking not at what the messages said, but at what they were designed to counter. She found it at 2 a.m. A single transaction. One of the ones she'd documented in her first 3 months of research. A movement of money through a shell entity that she'd traced back to a specific correspondent bank. appeared in the communications as a subject of discussion between Kieran and Damien. The message was dated 14 months ago. It discussed the transaction as if it were future planning, what to move, how to move it, which entity to route it through. But Elena had the bank records. She'd obtained them through a legal research database, a matter of public record in the relevant jurisdiction, and she'd obtained them 10 months ago. And in the bank records, that transaction had already occurred. Had occurred 2 years before the message was allegedly sent. Damien had fabricated a message about a transaction that had already happened and dated the message to make it look like planning. He'd assumed no one would have the bank records. He'd assumed the financial trail would be obscured enough that the timing inconsistency would be invisible. He'd assumed wrong. She sat in the chair and stared at the screen and felt something that was not quite elation and not quite relief. Something colder than both, a focused, precision-grade clarity that she'd only felt a few times in her life, the feeling of a key finding the lock it was made for. She had it. Not all of it. Not enough yet to take apart the entire communications evidence. But this single timestamp inconsistency tied to a bank record she could authenticate, this was the thread. If she pulled it correctly, the rest would follow. She reached for her phone to call Marsh. Then she heard the front door. She stopped. It was 2:15 in the morning. Agnes was asleep on the 3rd floor. Kieran was in the Roman facility on Pryor Street. Nobody had a key to this house except Agnes, Kieran, and... She closed the laptop. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat in the dark in Kieran's office and listened. Footsteps in the entrance hall. Even pressured, unhurried. The walk of a man who had never needed to be anywhere in a hurry because he'd always arranged for everywhere to wait. She knew those footsteps. She'd been identifying them by their quality since she was 9 years old. Damien Vale was in the house. She did not move. She sat in the dark with the laptop closed and the external hard drive connected and her phone in her hand, and she breathed very carefully and thought about the specific arithmetic of this moment with the full, frightened clarity of someone who has just understood that the person they've been investigating has also been investigating them, and has known for longer, and has now come to do something about it. The footsteps moved toward the office. She looked at the external hard drive. She looked at the door. She calculated the distance and the time and understood with a cold, complete certainty that she had approximately 15 seconds before Damien Vale opened that door, and that the 18 months of evidence on that hard drive was the only thing that stood between Kieran Voss and a verdict that would bury him for the rest of his life, and that if Damien Vale got his hands on it tonight, it would be gone. She pulled the hard drive from the laptop. She stood. She looked at the window behind the desk, the one that faced the back garden, the same garden she'd looked at from her bedroom window on her first night in this house, 11 years ago. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. She had stopped breathing without noticing. The door handle moved, the door opened. Elena was already at the window. She didn't run. Running made sound, and sound was the one thing she couldn't afford in the 3 seconds between the door handle moving and the lamp coming on, which it did, flooding the office with light from the fixture overhead that she hadn't touched, that Damien had found with the ease of someone who knew exactly where it was because he'd been in this room hundreds of times before. She was behind the desk, between the desk and the window, and she had the hard drive in her right hand and her phone in her left, and she was not breathing. Damien stood in the doorway. He was wearing a coat, dark, long, the kind of coat that belonged to the version of him that appeared at dinner tables, composed, unhurried, radiating the specific warmth that she had spent 11 years identifying as performance. He looked at her across the office with an expression that was not surprised, not even close to surprised, the expression of a man who has calculated your position and arrived to confirm the calculation. "Elena," he said. She said nothing. He looked at the desk, at the closed laptop, at the empty port where the hard drive had been. His eyes moved to her right hand. "You've been busy," he said. "Get out of this house." "I have a key." He held it up, an old one, brass, the kind that fit the original locks that Kieran had never replaced because Kieran had trusted Damien with everything, including the locks. "Kieran gave it to me, years ago." "Kieran isn't here." "No." He stepped into the room, slow, even pressured. "He's not." She moved laterally, keeping the desk between them, her eyes on his hands. Both visible. No weapon she could see. That meant nothing. Whatever you think is on that drive, Damien said, nodding toward her right hand, I want you to think carefully about what you're going to do with it. Not because of what it means for Kieran, because of what it means for you. Is that a threat? It's a conversation. It's 2 a.m. and you broke into a house where you have no legal basis to be and you're standing between me and the door. That's not a conversation. He stopped. He was 7 feet from her now, on the other side of the desk, and he stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with those warm, readable eyes, and the thing she'd seen at 16, the thing underneath the warmth, the chess player's assessment, was fully visible now, not hidden, not even bothering to be hidden. You're very good, he said. I want you to know that I mean that. The shell company documentation, I found out about it 8 months ago. One of the database searches flagged a pattern of access. I've been watching you build the case since March. A pause. You found the timestamp inconsistency. She kept her face still. I can see it in your face, he said. You found it tonight, which is why you're standing there with the drive in your hand instead of being asleep. He tilted his head slightly. It's a good find. It would have been a problem. Would have been. The bank record you were referencing, he said, is going to disappear from the database by morning. I have the access. I've had it for 6 months. In case you found the thread. He watched her absorb this. The only copy of that record is what you already downloaded. And what you downloaded is on that drive. And that drive is in your hand in a room alone with me. The room was very quiet. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest that she refused to let reach her face. So, he said, here's the conversation. Give me the drive. Walk away from the case. Go back to university. Finish your degree. Become the attorney you're going to be. Kieran goes to prison. He does 8 to 12. He's out before he's 70. He's provided for. Nobody touches him inside because I'll make sure of it. He paused. Or don't give me the drive. And what happens next is something neither of us is going to enjoy. She looked at him for a long moment. You practiced that, she said. He blinked, fractionally. Excuse me? That speech, the pacing of it, the part about nobody touching him inside. You knew that would be the thing most likely to make me hesitate. She shifted her weight slightly, redistributing it, her feet finding a better position on the floor. You've been running this conversation in your head for months since you found out about the database searches. You came here tonight because I found the timestamp, which means my timeline just accelerated past what you'd planned for, and you needed to get ahead of it. She looked at him. You're scared. The warmth in his eyes did something. It didn't disappear. It was too ingrained for that, too practiced, but it shifted, reconfigured around something harder. Give me the drive, Elena. No. He moved. Not fast. He wasn't a fast man. That wasn't how he operated. But purposefully, around the left side of the desk, and she went right simultaneously, putting the desk's length between them again, and they stood at opposite ends of it like something that had been a conversation and had now become something else. Don't, she said. The drive. If you touch me, she said, I will burn every piece of this down in a way that the evidence doesn't matter anymore. I will walk into the police station on Crane Street, not federal, local, the one that Kieran doesn't own, and I will tell them that Damien Vale broke into a private residence and attempted to intimidate a witness in an active federal case. That's obstruction. That's a separate charge. That puts you in a room with investigators who are going to start pulling your financials, and your financials, Damien, are the one thing you cannot afford anyone to pull right now. He stopped. She was breathing hard. She could feel it. The effort of keeping her voice level while her lungs were doing something panicked underneath. But she kept her eyes on him and her chin up and her feet planted. You'd burn Kieran with it, Damien said. Local police talk to federal. You walk in there tonight. I walk in there tonight with the hard drive and 18 months of documentation and a timestamp inconsistency that proves the communications evidence is fabricated. I walk in there as a second-year law student who came home to help and found an intruder in the house. The narrative writes itself, and you know it. Silence. She watched him calculate. She could see it happening. The rapid internal movement of a man who has always been 3 steps ahead, discovering that the board has been rearranged while he wasn't watching. Then he smiled, and the smile was different from every smile she'd seen from him in 11 years. Not warm, not performed, stripped of all the social engineering and sitting there on his face as what it actually was, which was the expression of a man who has decided to stop pretending. "You're extraordinary, Tom," he said. Truly. Kieran had no idea what he picked up off the street. He straightened his coat. "But you're 20 years old, and I've been doing this since before you were born, and the database record is going to be gone in 4 hours regardless of what happens tonight." He walked toward the door, unhurried, back to his own rhythm. The timestamp without the authenticated bank record is suggestive at best. You know that. Marsh and Cahill will know it. And by the time you find another thread, the trial will be over. He reached the doorway. He turned. "I'm sorry about Eli," he said. "I always thought that was an unfortunate night." He left. She stood behind the desk and listened to his footsteps cross the entrance hall and the front door open and close, and she stood there for 30 seconds after the sound of his car had faded before her legs decided they were done with the current arrangement, and she sat down on the floor. The hard drive was in her hand. She looked at it. She was shaking. She could see it, her hands giving it away. The fine, continuous tremor of a body that has been holding an enormous amount of tension and has just been given permission to release some of it. 4 hours. She got up. She sat at the desk and opened the laptop and plugged the hard drive in and found the bank record. The specific one, the correspondent bank in the secondary jurisdiction, the transaction record with the timestamp that predated the fabricated message by 2 years. And she looked at it and thought about what Damien had said and knew he was right. Without authentication, the record was suggestive. Courts required more than suggestive. She needed to authenticate it before he deleted it from the database. She looked at the clock. 2:41 in the morning. She picked up her phone and called a number she'd saved 7 months ago and never used. The number of a financial forensics specialist named Dr. Kara Venn, who worked at the university's law school and who had published 3 papers on digital authentication of financial records in cross-jurisdictional cases. Papers Elena had read twice and annotated carefully. It rang 4 times. "This is Venn." Groggy. Irritated. "Dr. Venn, my name is Elena Cross. I'm a second-year student in the JD program. I'm sorry to call at this hour. I have a financial record in a live federal case that is going to be deleted from its source database within approximately 4 hours, and I need to know if there is a way to authenticate a downloaded copy before that happens." A long pause. "What case?" Venn said. "Voss. The Velmore laundering case." Another pause. Longer. "That case is all over the financial law circles. Who are you to the defendant?" "I'm the person who's been documenting the actual perpetrator for 18 months. Silence. Then, "Send me what you have. Right now. Everything. I'll look at it." Elena sent it. She sat at the desk and watched the upload progress bar, and thought about Damien's car pulling away from the curb, and where he was going and what 4 hours meant in real terms, and whether Kara Venn was going to open her email and see what Elena had built and understand what it was. Her phone rang at 3:20. "The timestamp on the downloaded record," Venn said, and her voice was different now. Not groggy, not irritated, sharp and focused, the voice of someone who has looked at something and recognized what it is. "When you downloaded this, your browser and your operating system both created a local timestamp. If the source database is deleted or altered after your download time, that local timestamp, combined with the hash value of the file, which I can extract, constitutes a form of authentication. It's not bulletproof, but in front of the right judge, with the right expert testimony, it's enough to raise reasonable doubt about when the document existed and what it contains." Elena exhaled. "Will you testify?" she asked. "Send me the full documentation package," Venn said. "By morning. If it's what the timestamp suggests it is, yes." Elena worked until 5. She assembled the full package, the shell company chain, the forged signature analysis, the timestamp inconsistency, the hash value documentation that Venn had talked her through extracting, the 18 months of records organized in the sequential structure she'd been building since the night she found the first shell company. She sent it to Venn at 5:17. She sent a parallel copy to Marsh at 5:19, with a message that was 6 lines long and ended with, "I need to be added to the defense team. Call me when you're in the office." Then she drove to the Remand facility on Pryor Street. Visiting hours didn't start until 8. She sat in the parking lot and watched the sky change color, and didn't sleep, and thought about Eli. which she did sometimes when she was waiting for something she couldn't control. Brought him out deliberately, held him in her mind, let herself feel the specific weight of him, which kept her honest about why she was doing this and what it cost and what it was worth. He would have been 16. He would have been afraid of pigeons and eaten broken crackers first and laughed at things that weren't funny. He would have been alive if she'd been smarter, faster, better at the math. That was the version of it she sometimes carried, the one where her failure to get Damien Vale exposed sooner had a cost measured not in evidence but in the original fact, the frozen night, the 40 minutes she and Kieran had spent going back for food instead of driving directly to the hospital. She stopped. She knew that road and she knew where it ended, and she didn't have time for it today. She went in at 8. Kieran came into the visitation room and looked at her face and sat down without a word. He'd learned over the years to read her the same way she'd learned to read him. The specific vocabulary of the other person, the tells and the calibrations. And what he read in her face now made him go very still. "Talk," he said. She talked. All of it. Damien in the house, the conversation, the threat, the database deletion, Ven, the hash authentication, the package she'd sent to Marsh. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping, laying it out in the sequential order in which it had happened, and Kieran sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and didn't interrupt once. When she finished, the silence held for a moment. "He was in the house," Kieran said. "Yes. He stood in front of you and I handled it." His jaw was doing something. She recognized the specific set of it, the thing that happened when something moved inside him that he was deciding whether to let out. If he had, he didn't. "Elena," Kieran. She held his gaze. "I need you to focus on the case right now. I need you to call Marsh today and authorize adding me to the defense team, not as a junior researcher, as the attorney who built the financial documentation. That's the role I need, and it's the role the evidence requires. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd first cataloged at the hospital, the one that had something in it she couldn't fully name, something that lived in the neighborhood of pride and grief, and the specific disorientation of a man who has tried very hard to protect something and has had to watch it protect itself instead. "Yes," he said. "Good." She stood. "I'll be at Marsh's office by 10. "Elena." She looked back. "He'll try again," Kieran said. "Not the same way. He'll recalculate. He knows now that you're further along than he thought." "I know." "He doesn't—" Kieran stopped. The jaw again. "He doesn't respond well to being outmaneuvered. I know how he responds. I've watched it twice in 16 years, both times with men who pushed him into a corner." "What happened to them?" Kieran held her eyes. "They stopped being a problem." She absorbed this. "How much time do you think I have before he moves to the next plan?" "Days? Maybe less." She nodded once. "Then I won't waste any." Marsh and Cahill's offices occupied the 14th floor of a building on Velmore's financial district, the kind of floor that had been designed to make clients feel that their money was being held in capable hands. Dark wood, low light, the particular quality of carpet that absorbed footsteps. Richard Marsh was 60, white-haired, with the composed authority of a man who had argued in front of appellate courts for 30 years and had developed the specific stillness of someone for whom composure was professional equipment rather than personal trait. He looked at Elena across his desk at 10:15 in the morning with the file she'd sent him open in front of him and said, "You're 20 years old." "Yes." "You built this in 18 months while enrolled full-time." "Yes." He looked back at the file. He turned a page, then another. He stopped at the shell company chain diagram she'd constructed, which mapped all 7 entities with their jurisdiction registrations and the money flows between them in a visual structure that made the architecture immediately legible. He looked at it for a while. "The timestamp authentication," he said. "Ven's willing to testify." She confirmed this morning. "The fabricated communications, you're arguing they were built specifically to counter your investigation. I can demonstrate that the message dates correspond directly to the periods when database access patterns suggest someone was monitoring my research trail. Damien knew what I was finding. He built the communications to make my evidence look partial." Marsh closed the file. He looked at her over the top of it. "If I add you to the defense team, you understand what that means for your academic standing, for your bar application. You're going to be attached to a criminal defense in one of the highest profile organized crime trials this city has seen in 20 years. I understand. And if we lose, we won't, she said. Not loudly, not with the performance of confidence, just the flat, precise statement of someone who has looked at the math and arrived at a specific answer. The timestamp inconsistency is real. The forged signatures are documentable. Ven's authentication method will hold. If you give me 2 weeks to finish the financial chain documentation and a forensic accountant who can present the shell company structure to a jury in terms they can follow, we have a case. Marsh looked at her for a long time. Kieran Voss called me an hour ago, he said. I know. He said, Marsh paused as if deciding how much of this to relay. He said to give you whatever you need. She kept her face still. 2 weeks, Marsh said, and I want daily updates. Every piece of evidence you add to the file comes through me first. This is my case and my client and my license. Understood. And cross. He opened the file again. If there's anything in here that cuts against us, anything that Damien can use, anything that implicates Kieran in the legitimate sense rather than the manufactured one, I need to know before the prosecution does. She met his eyes. There's nothing. I've been through every transaction. Kieran signed documents he didn't read. That's negligence, not criminality. The actual criminal architecture belongs entirely to Damien. You're certain? I've spent 18 months being certain. He nodded slowly. All right. He closed the file. Welcome to the defense. She worked out of Marsh and Cahill for 11 days without going back to Aldrich Hill. She slept on the couch in the junior associates' lounge for 4 hours at a stretch and woke up and worked again. The forensic accountant Marsh assigned, a small, precise woman named Holt, who communicated primarily through annotated spreadsheets and single-sentence observations delivered with the gravity of verdicts, went through Elena's shell company documentation and confirmed the chain and added 3 additional layers Elena hadn't found, which pushed the total money movement figure to a number that made both of them sit quietly for a moment when it appeared on the screen. Ven prepared her testimony. The hash authentication held up under Marsh's cross-examination rehearsal and then under the prosecution's anticipated counter-arguments, which Marsh wargamed with the thoroughness of a man who had been surprised in court once in his career and had decided once was enough. On the 12th day, Damien Vale's attorneys filed a motion to exclude Elena from the courtroom on the grounds that she was a potential witness and could not serve simultaneously as defense counsel. The motion was technically arguable. Marsh responded within 6 hours with a brief that was 30 pages long and that Elena had written 22 of, and the judge denied the exclusion motion the following morning. On the 13th day, Elena got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. You should have taken the deal, Damien said. She was standing in the corridor outside Marsh's office. She looked at the wall in front of her and breathed and said, There was no deal. There was a threat. The trial starts in 3 days. I know. I have resources you haven't found yet. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, measured, warm at the edges, the performance never fully abandoned even now. People inside the evidence chain. If certain documentation is questioned on authenticity grounds, Damien, she kept her voice very level. I know what you're going to do. You're going to try to discredit Ven. You're going to argue that the hash authentication is insufficient. You're going to put a technical witness on the stand to create uncertainty about the timestamp evidence. She paused. I've already prepared for all 3. Silence. You're going to lose, she said. I want you to know that I'm not telling you that out of anger or out of whatever you think this is for me. I'm telling you because I've looked at the evidence from every angle, and that's the conclusion the evidence produces. And I think somewhere in that very precise and careful mind of yours, you already know it too. A long pause. 3 days, he said, and his voice had lost something in it, some quality she couldn't immediately identify, something that sounded almost like the thing underneath the warmth, the thing she'd glimpsed at 16, finally surfacing without the performance around it. Raw, for just a moment. And what was raw underneath Damien Vale, she understood for the first time, was not malice. It was fear. The specific, deep fear of a man who has structured his entire existence around control and is watching the structure fail. 3 days, Elena, and everything you think you have is going to be challenged piece by piece in front of a jury that doesn't understand financial law and doesn't want to. I know, she said. That's why I've been preparing for 12 days straight. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor and looked at the wall and felt the exhaustion, the real Physical exhaustion, the kind that had been building for nearly 2 weeks of 4-hour sleep and 12-hour workdays, and the constant, sustained effort of holding an enormous amount of moving information in her head and keeping it organized. Her eyes hurt. Her shoulders had developed a specific ache that she'd been ignoring successfully until this moment. She was 20 years old, and she was 3 days from standing in a federal courtroom and dismantling a case that had been built by a man who had been doing this before she was born. She went back into the office. She sat down at the desk. She opened the file. She worked. The morning of the trial, she arrived at the courthouse at 7:15. The trial wasn't scheduled until 9. She sat in the marble corridor outside the courtroom on a bench and went through the evidence sequence one more time in her head. The order she was going to present it. The specific moments she was going to call for Venn. The cross-examination structure she'd built for the prosecution's financial witnesses. The single document she'd saved for last. The one she'd decided 3 days ago was the closing argument center, the piece that made everything else cohere into a shape a jury could hold. Marsh arrived at 7:50. He looked at her and said, "Ready?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "When we get in there, follow my lead on the procedural elements. The judge doesn't know you. You're going to have to earn the room before you can own it." "I know." "And cross." He paused. "When you see Kieran brought in, I'll be fine. I was going to say don't look at him until you're ready. The jury's going to be watching you the moment you walk in. First impressions." She nodded. "I know." At 8:50, the doors to the courtroom opened. She picked up her case. She stood. She straightened her jacket, dark blue, the one she'd bought specifically for this, the one that was professional without being performative, and she walked through the doors and into the room where the next 3 days were going to determine whether Kieran Voss went home or went to prison. The prosecution team was already seated. Their lead attorney was a man named Garrett Cross. No relation, she'd confirmed this, 50. Experienced. The kind of courtroom presence that came from 2 decades of federal cases and a conviction rate he was not shy about. He looked up when she walked in, and his eyes moved over her with the quick professional assessment of a man who catalogs new variables as a reflex. And she watched him recalibrate slightly when he understood that she was defense counsel and not a clerk. Good. Let him recalibrate. She sat down at the defense table and opened her case and arranged the documents in the order she needed them and did not look at the defendant's entrance door. She heard it open at 9:03. She heard the specific quality of the room shift, the slight collective movement of the spectators, the whisper of attention reorienting. And she heard the footsteps that she had spent 11 years cataloging, and they were slower than she remembered and more careful. And she felt something move through her chest that she was not going to process right now. She looked up. Kieran Voss walked to the defendant's chair in the clothes Marsh had arranged for him. Dark suit, plain tie, the deliberate plainness of a man being presented as something other than what he was. And he sat down, and he looked forward, and then he turned his head and looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to communicate what she needed to communicate, which was, "I have it. Trust me." He held her gaze for the same 2 seconds, long enough to communicate what he needed to communicate back, which she received not as words but as weight, the specific, enormous weight of a man who has spent his entire life not trusting anyone completely, handing that over. She looked back at her documents. The judge entered. The room stood. The trial of Kieran Voss, organized crime figure, alleged architect of an international money laundering conspiracy, began on a Tuesday morning in February with rain against the courthouse windows and a gallery packed with journalists and the entire weight of 15 years of Damien Vale's careful construction arranged on the prosecution's table like a wall. Elena Cross opened her notebook to the first page, and somewhere in the gallery, in the third row from the back on the left side, Damien Vale sat with his coat folded across his lap and his face composed and his eyes on the defense table with the expression of a man who is watching something he cannot stop and has not yet fully accepted that he cannot stop it, and his right hand, resting on his knee, was not entirely still. The first day of trial was about establishing ground. Elena understood this the way she understood most things now. Not theoretically, but physically, in the body, the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not from the diagram, but from the specific resistance of tissue under a blade. Garrett Cross spent the morning building his version of Kieran Voss for the jury, methodical, unhurried, laying foundation stones one at a time. The financial records, the shell company registrations, the volume of money. He said the number slowly. Let it sit in the air of the courtroom for a moment before moving on, because large numbers needed room to register as real. He was good. Elena sat at the defense table and watched him work and annotated her notes and did not underestimate him, because underestimating Garrett Cross would be the specific kind of error that couldn't be corrected. Marsh handled the first day's cross-examinations. Elena had prepared them. She sat beside him and watched the prosecution's witnesses and measured the distance between what they were saying and what they actually knew, which in 2 cases was substantial and in 1 case was almost negligible. The prosecution's first financial witness, a forensic accountant from the federal task force, was thorough and credible and presented the shell company architecture in a way that was clear without being oversimplified. And Elena watched the jury watching him and understood that he was landing. She wrote 1 sentence on the notepad between her and Marsh. He's building the map. We need to show them a different map before they memorize his. Marsh read it, nodded once. That night, in the Junior Associates Lounge at Marsh and Cahill, Elena rebuilt the opening of her financial presentation from the ground up. Not changing the evidence. The evidence was fixed, immovable, the product of 18 months of work that didn't need to be improved. Changing the sequence. The prosecution had presented the money flows as originating from Kieran, tracing downward from him through the shell company layers to the eventual concealment. She was going to present the same flows in reverse, starting at the concealment, tracing upward, and showing the jury not a man directing money into a system, but a system that had been designed to frame a man, constructed from the bottom up by someone who understood exactly whose name to put at the top. It was the difference between a portrait and an X-ray. The portrait showed you what something wanted to look like. The X-ray showed you what was underneath. She finished at 3 in the morning. She slept for 4 hours. She woke up and went back to the courthouse. The second day belonged to the communications evidence. Garrett Cross presented it carefully. The emails, the encrypted messages, the apparent record of Kieran directing Damien through the laundering operations. He walked the jury through the message thread chronologically, reading selected excerpts in a voice that was measured and flat, deliberately uninflected, because he understood that letting the jury hear them without emotional coloring was more damaging than performing them. He let the words do the work. They were written in Kieran's register, compressed, direct, the syntax of someone who communicated in the minimal necessary. And they were convincing, and Elena sat at the defense table and watched the jury's faces and watched the thing she'd been afraid of happening, which was that the messages were landing as real. When Cross finished, Marsh stood for cross-examination. He asked 4 questions. Efficient, precise, each one targeted at a specific element of the authentication chain, where the messages had been recovered from, who had handled the server, what the chain of custody looked like. The prosecution's technical witness answered competently. Marsh sat down. Elena stood. The judge looked at her. Miss Cross, thank you, Your Honor. She moved to the center of the floor. She had a tablet in her hand with the financial records she needed, and she stood at a distance from the witness that was close enough to be direct without being aggressive, and she looked at the prosecution's technical expert and said, "The messages were recovered from a server. Which server, specifically?" The witness named it. A cloud server, private, registered to an account associated with Kieran Voss's primary email address. When was that account created? The records indicate. The witness checked. 4 years ago. 4 years ago. And the messages in question are dated across a period beginning 3 years ago and ending 8 months ago. Correct. So the account existed for 1 year before any of the messages were sent. Yes. During that first year, the year between the account's creation and the first message, was there any other activity on the account? Any emails sent or received? Any files stored? Any login records? A pause. I'd have to check I have the access logs. She brought them up on the tablet, handed a copy to the clerk, had it entered as a defense exhibit. The account shows no activity of any kind between its creation and the date of the first message. No logins, no file storage, no emails. 1 full year of a private cloud account with no activity whatsoever. She let that sit. Is it common, she said, in your experience with digital forensics, for an individual to create a private cloud account for sensitive communications and then not use it for a full year? It's not impossible. Is it common? No, the witness said. It's not common. What would be a more common explanation for a year of inactivity followed by a sudden pattern of use? Garrett Cross was on his feet. Objection calls for speculation. I'll rephrase, Elena said. In cases where you've examined digital accounts that showed this pattern, dormancy followed by sudden activity, what were the typical findings regarding account ownership? A pause. The witness understood where this was going. In some cases, dormancy followed by activity indicated that the account had been accessed by someone other than the registered owner. Someone other than the registered owner, Elena repeated. Not loudly. She didn't need volume. Thank you. She sat down. She could feel the shift in the room. Not dramatic, not visible on any individual face, but in the collective quality of the attention, the jury's attention, the slight recalibration of people who have been given a second possibility and are now holding two versions of the same fact simultaneously. That was all she needed today. Not persuasion, doubt. On the third day, she called Kara Venn. Venn was 53, with the compact, precise energy of someone who thought faster than she moved, and had learned to move at a pace that let the thinking stay ahead. She took the stand with her materials organized and answered Elena's questions with the combination of technical exactness and plain language that Elena had spent 2 weeks working with her to develop, not dumbing down, just translating, making the architecture of digital authentication legible to 12 people who had not spent their careers in financial forensics. The timestamp evidence, the hash value, the bank record, authenticated, the downloaded copy confirmed as an accurate reproduction of a record that had, in the days since Elena's download, been deleted from its source database. Deleted. Which Elena asked Venn to confirm twice, and which Venn confirmed twice, and which she watched land on the jury's faces like something physical. Why would a bank record be deleted from a public financial database? Elena asked. Objection, Cross said. Speculation. Withdrawn, Elena said. She turned to the jury instead, and she didn't say anything because she didn't need to, because the question was already in the room and it was going to stay there. She spent the next hour walking Venn through the timestamp inconsistency. The message dated 14 months ago that discussed a transaction which the authenticated bank record proved had occurred 2 years before the message was allegedly sent. She put both documents on the courtroom display simultaneously. She gave the jury time to look at both of them. She pointed to the dates. She did not editorialize. She let the numbers exist in the same space and do what numbers do when they contradict each other, which is produce a problem that has to be resolved. These two dates, she said. Can both be accurate? No, Venn said. They cannot. One of them is wrong. One of them is wrong. And if the bank record, which you've authenticated as an accurate reproduction of a document that existed prior to my download date, if that record is accurate, what does that make the message? It makes the message, Venn said, with the specific careful delivery of someone who has practiced this sentence many times and is saying it now exactly as practiced, a fabrication dated to appear as planning for a transaction that had already occurred. The courtroom was very quiet. Elena said, Thank you, Dr. Venn. She sat down. Cross spent 40 minutes on cross-examination, and he was good, and he found every technical vulnerability in the hash authentication argument and pressed each one, and Venn held. Not perfectly. There were 2 moments where the exchange became genuinely uncertain, where Cross pushed the authentication method into its limits, and Venn had to acknowledge those limits. But she held on the central point, which was the timestamp, which was the date discrepancy, which was the thing that could not be explained away because the numbers simply did not allow it. Elena watched the jury during the cross-examination, and she watched them doing the thing she'd been waiting for them to do, which was stop listening to the argument and start looking at the documents, which was exactly right, which was where she needed them. That afternoon, she presented the shell company chain. Holt, the forensic accountant, took the stand and presented the financial architecture in the reverse order structure Elena had rebuilt 3 nights ago, and she did it with the methodical, annotated precision that was her natural mode. And Elena watched the jury, watching the money flow backward, from concealment toward origin, and watched them arrive, one by one, at the thing the map was designed to show them. Damian Vale's name. At the bottom of every chain, on every founding document, in every jurisdiction, not directing money, building the pipes the money moved through, building them years before the transactions that used them, building them with Kieran Voss's name placed precisely at the top, not because Kieran had put it there, but because the structure had been designed to hold it there, the way a frame holds a painting, the way a stage holds a performance. Garrett Cross's cross-examination of Holt was aggressive and technically sophisticated and found three legitimate areas of uncertainty in the financial chain, and Elena noted each one and knew she'd need to address them in closing. And she watched Holt hold the central structure intact under the pressure of it and felt something that was very close to gratitude. By the end of the third day, the room had changed. She could feel it in the quality of the silences. Not in the jury's faces, they were trained by the judge's instructions and their own decorum to give nothing away, but in the silences between questions, in the specific texture of the room's attention. Something had shifted from settled to open. The prosecution's case, which had arrived at the beginning of 3 days looking like a wall, had developed seams, not collapsed, but seamed. It was enough. She was walking out of the courtroom at the end of the third day, her case in her hand, Marsh beside her, when she heard it. A sound. Sharp. Not loud, not the bang of a movie, not the dramatic report she'd grown up associating with the idea of violence. Just a sharp, abbreviated sound from the direction of the gallery, followed immediately by shouting and the crash of something overturning, and the specific quality of a room going from order to chaos in less than 2 seconds. She spun. Damien Vale was standing in the third row of the gallery. He had a weapon in his hand. She registered it before she understood it, her brain filing the visual before the meaning arrived. And he was not pointing it at her. He was pointing it at Kieran, who was being guided by a bailiff toward the defendant's door, and whose back was partially turned. Everything happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Kieran's instincts, 30 years of them, the specific, finely tuned survival instinct of a man who had lived in violent spaces for decades, fired before his conscious mind. He was already moving, already turning, already dropping below the line of the weapon, and his hand was going to his hip where a weapon was not. Because this was a courtroom and he was a defendant and he was unarmed, and she saw the specific moment his hand found nothing and his body recalculated. Elena was moving. She didn't decide to move. Her legs decided, carrying the rest of her, and she was between Damien and Kieran before she had a clear thought about it, standing in the space between the gallery rail and the defendant's door with her arms slightly out and her case still in her left hand, and the absurdity of that. The leather case, the documents, the 18 months of evidence held in her hand while she stood in front of a weapon was something she registered and immediately set aside. The room was screaming, bailiffs converging. Garrett Cross had gone sideways behind the prosecution table. Damien looked at her. His face was not the composed, warm face she'd known for 15 years. It was not even the stripped, raw face she'd glimpsed at 16 or heard at 2 in the morning when he'd called her 3 days before trial. It was something she'd never seen from him, which was the face of a man who has run out of positions and is standing in the last open space with nowhere left to move, and who is frightened in the specific way that removes everything except the instinct to stop what is ending him. "Damien," she said. Her voice came out level. She did not know how. "Move," he said. "No." "Elena, move." "No." She held his eyes. Her heart was doing something extraordinary in her chest. Not the controlled, elevated rate of the past weeks of trial preparation, but something genuinely animal, a slamming urgency that she was overriding with everything she had. "You're done. It's over. There are cameras in this room and 100 witnesses, and every bailiff in the building is 30 seconds away. And if you do this, the case I just built against you is going to look like a footnote next to what happens to you for doing this in a federal courtroom. The case." He said it with something that might have been a laugh if it had more air in it. "Your case. My case that just put your name at the bottom of every shell company in 4 jurisdictions. My case that just showed a jury a bank record you tried to delete." She kept her voice steady. "Put it down, Damien. You don't—" He stopped, started again. "You don't understand what he took from me. Tell me. I built that empire." His voice had something in it now, something that was coming loose from wherever he'd been keeping it, the specific unraveling of a man whose constructed version of himself is coming apart, and who is discovering that underneath it there is something that has been in pain for a very long time. 16 years. Every structure, every operation, every connection. I built it. He stood at the front of it, and people feared him, and I built every single thing he stood on, and he never once. "Damien, he gave you a room with a lock on the inside," he said. "He picked up a child from a bridge and gave her a room, and in 2 years she had more of him than I had in 16. His hand was shaking. She could see it. The fine, continuous tremor, the body expressing what the face was trying to control. I wanted what he had, not the money, what he was, what people saw when they looked at him. I spent 16 years trying to build that, and it was never. Kieran stepped forward. He stepped around Elena, not pushing her aside, not moving through her, moving around her with a deliberate care that preserved the space she'd put herself in. And he stood where she'd been standing, between Damien and the rest of the room. And he looked at the man he'd trusted for 16 years across a distance of 8 feet. "Put it down," Kieran said, not loudly. In the voice he used when things were already decided, and the only remaining question was how the other person was going to arrive at the same conclusion. "You gave her—" "I know what I gave her." Kieran held his eyes. His face was the face she'd known for 11 years. The jaw, the scar, the gray-green eyes with the stillness in them that had always reminded her of something just beneath the surface. "I know what I had. I know what I didn't give you. If there's a debt there, Damien, I'll own it, but not like this. You can't. Put it down." A pause. "Please." The word landed strangely. She had almost never heard it from him. It had weight in it because of its rarity, the specific weight of a word that cost something from the person saying it. Damien looked at him. The weapon was still up, but the arm holding it was losing conviction, the tremor becoming something larger. And Elena watched Damien Vale's face in the moment that the thing he'd built himself around, the grievance, the strategy, the careful, long construction of a revenge that had consumed a decade and a half of his life, finally ran out of structure to hold it. And what was left was a man standing in a federal courtroom with a weapon in a shaking hand and nowhere left to go. He lowered it, not because he'd decided to, because his arm simply stopped. The bailiffs were on him in the next 4 seconds. Elena stood where she was. She did not move until Damien was on the floor with his hands behind him, and then she turned and looked at Kieran, who was standing 2 feet from her and looking at the space where Damien had been with an expression on his face that she did not have a word for and did not try to name. She put her hand on his arm. One brief, specific contact, palm flat against his forearm, a second, 2, and then she let go. He looked at her. His eyes did something she'd only seen once before, at the hospital corridor, when she'd said Eli's name and the bottom had gone out of him for a moment. "Come on," she said. "Let's finish it." The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Elena sat in the corridor outside the deliberation room for most of it. Marsh sat with her for 2 hours and then had things he needed to do and left her with coffee. She didn't drink, and a sandwich she ate mechanically because her body required it. The corridor was marble and high-ceilinged, and her footsteps echoed when she walked its length, which she did periodically because sitting still for 9 hours was not something her body would accept without negotiation. She thought about everything during those 9 hours. Not the case. The case was finished, out of her hands, living now in the minds of 12 people she couldn't reach. But everything around it, Eli, which she always did when she was waiting for something she couldn't control, the bridge, the burning cardboard in the oil drum, and the way the orange light had moved against the concrete pylons. Damien's face when he'd said, "You don't understand what he took from me," which she found she couldn't entirely set aside, which stayed with her in the way that true things stay even when they're inconvenient. She understood what he'd meant. She even understood at some level she was still organizing, why he'd done it. Not excusing it, not absorbing it as anything other than what it was, but understanding the specific long grief of someone who builds things and watches someone else receive the credit. It didn't make any of it acceptable, but it made it human, and she found that she needed to keep it human rather than let it harden into the clean, uncomplicated narrative of a villain, because hardening it would be a lie, and she didn't deal in lies. She was 20 years old, and she had stood in a courtroom for 3 days and taken apart 15 years of careful construction, and Damien Vale was going to prison, and Kieran Voss was waiting in a holding room for a verdict, and she was sitting in a marble corridor eating a sandwich and thinking about a 5-year-old boy who had been afraid of pigeons. The jury came back at 6:47 in the evening. She was in the courtroom when the foreperson stood. She was at the defense table. Marsh was beside her. Kieran was in his chair, and she was not looking at him because she'd promised herself she wouldn't until it was over, in either direction. "On the charge of conspiracy to launder monetary instruments," the foreperson said. And then there was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second and felt substantially longer. "Not guilty." She did not react. She kept her face exactly where it was. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud financial institutions, not guilty. Beside her, she felt Marsh exhale. On the charge of racketeering under the federal statute, not guilty. The room moved. She could feel it, the gallery shifting, the sound, the specific wave of reaction that moved through a space when something unexpected and large has just happened. She heard a journalist in the gallery stand and move for the door. She heard Garrett Cross say something to his second chair in a low, compressed voice. She turned and looked at Kieran. He was looking at her. He'd been looking at her. His face was doing something she couldn't fully read. Too many things at once. The specific collision of relief and exhaustion and something else. Something deep and unpracticed. A feeling that he clearly didn't have a prepared container for and was having to hold carefully. She held his gaze. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But something passed between them in those 4 seconds that was complete enough not to need language, which was just as well because she didn't have any. The weeks that followed were strange in a specific way she hadn't anticipated. The aftermath of large things is always strange. The body and mind accustomed to a state of sustained emergency, suddenly required to function in ordinary time at an ordinary pace, discovering that the adjustment is not automatic. Kieran came back to the house on Aldrich Hill on a Tuesday. Agnes had prepared a meal that was considerably more elaborate than anything Agnes had previously disclosed she was capable of preparing, and nobody mentioned this. And they ate it in the kitchen, Kieran's kitchen, one of his 3 rooms, and talked about things that were not the trial, which was its own kind of work, the work of beginning to be ordinary again. Damien Vale was charged separately, in the week following the trial, with obstruction of justice, falsification of evidence, and the attempted assault in the courtroom. He eventually pled guilty to all charges. Elena was not in the room when he entered the plea. She did not need to be. She went back to university and finished her degree. She graduated in the top 3% of her program. At the graduation ceremony, Kieran sat in the auditorium in the same coat he'd worn to the open day 4 years earlier, in a different seat, closer this time, second row, and he watched her cross the stage and take the degree, and he did not applaud, because applauding was not something his hands knew how to do in public, but his face. In the photograph Agnes took from 3 seats over with a phone she had learned to use specifically for this occasion, had something in it that the photographer, Agnes, understood was important to capture accurately. It was not a smile exactly, but it was something in the neighborhood of one, something that had taken a long time to get there. The conversation happened the month after graduation, in the kitchen, which was where their real conversations had always happened. Kieran made coffee with his usual grim focus. Elena sat at the table where she'd done homework at 11 years old and watched him. "I want to talk about the Empire," she said. He turned, coffee in hand. The gesture was so familiar that it landed somewhere inside her with a specific ache that was not unhappy. "Which part?" he said. "All of it." She looked at him. "The legitimate operations are substantial, you know that. Holt's analysis showed the actual revenue from the clean businesses is... You don't need the other side anymore. You probably haven't for years." He sat down across from her. "I'm not suggesting you dismantle it overnight," she said. "I'm not that naive. People depend on it. Structure takes time. But I want to work on a plan. A real one. Not a gesture. A full transition. The import businesses, the properties, the financial holdings. We turn them into something that doesn't require you to operate the way you've been operating." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, then at her. "Why?" "Because you're 55 years old and you just spent 3 months in a remand facility for something you didn't do. And the reason you were vulnerable to that was because of the other things you did do. That vulnerability doesn't go away." She held his gaze. "And because you could do something real. The legitimate businesses have enough to fund. Shelters, legal aid, scholarships for kids who are where I was at 9. Not as a cover, as the actual thing." He was quiet for a long time. "You know what people will say," he said. "People who know what I am." "Yes. That it's a wash, that you can't, that what's been done can't be made into something else by writing a check." "I know that's what people will say. Do you think it's true?" She looked at him. She thought about Eli, and the bridge, and the oil drum with the burning cardboard, and the specific night that had produced everything that came after it. She thought about Damien Vale saying, "I built every single thing he stood on," with grief in his voice, that was real even when everything else had been constructed. She thought about what it meant to make something and what it meant to change something, and whether those were the same action or different ones. I think, she said, that the thing it becomes is real, regardless of what it came from. I think a shelter is a shelter. A scholarship is a scholarship. A child who doesn't sleep under a bridge because there was somewhere to go. That's real. That's not a wash. Kieran held her eyes. I'm not going to be fast at this, he said. I know. And I'm not going to be... He stopped, reorganized. I'm not a different person. You understand that. This doesn't make me... I know who you are, she said. I've known for 11 years. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm asking you to build different things. The silence in the kitchen had the quality of something settling, like a building after an earthquake, the specific sound of a structure adjusting to a new equilibrium. Okay, he said. It was the same word she'd said at the hospital, at the bridge. A word that carried different weights in different moments. This one was the heaviest, or maybe the lightest, depending on how you measured it, and she held it for a moment before she nodded and opened her notebook to the first page of the plan she'd been drafting for 3 months. They worked in the kitchen until midnight. The first shelter opened the following winter. No ceremony, no announcement, no press. A building on the south side of Velmore that had been a storage facility, converted and staffed and supplied quietly, the funding routed through one of the legitimate holding companies. It had beds for 40. It had a kitchen that produced hot meals twice a day. It had, in the entryway, a small bowl on a side table, Elena's idea, which she did not explain to anyone, that held nothing but was there. Elena staffed the legal aid component herself in the early months, working evenings after her days at the firm she'd joined, sitting across from people who needed help navigating systems that had been designed without them in mind, and giving them what she'd been given at 9 years old in a hospital corridor. Someone who stayed, who didn't ask for ID, who didn't make the help conditional. Kieran came to the shelter twice in the first year. Both times without announcement, both times staying less than an hour, walking through the rooms with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression he wore in all unfamiliar spaces. The flat, cataloging assessment of a man who reads a room before he decides what to do in it. The second time, he stood in the kitchen while a staff member served dinner to a group of people, and he watched it without speaking for 20 minutes. And Elena stood beside him and didn't say anything either, and the watching was its own kind of language. Every winter, they went back to the bridge. Not the first time they planned it, the first time it happened instinctively, on the anniversary of the night they'd met. Elena driving through the city and finding herself on the river road without having consciously decided to take it, pulling over, looking down at the embankment. She texted Kieran a location. He arrived 20 minutes later in the black SUV. They stood at the top of the embankment and looked at the underside of Dunmore Bridge. The oil drum was gone. The concrete was the same. The river had the same iron color. They had brought food, hot soup, sealed containers, the same way Marco had come back from Crane Street that night 30 years ago. Not money, not gestures, just the specific practical thing that the specific cold required. They left it at the base of the embankment and walked back up to the road. She's out there, Elena said. He looked at her. Someone like me, out there tonight. She was looking at the bridge. Not the same situation, but the same math, the same cold. Yes, he said. The shelter has 12 open beds. I know. She looked at him. He was standing in the same coat he always wore, the same gray-green eyes, the same jaw, and the same scar, and the same 55-year-old face that had absorbed more than she would ever know, and had arrived, through routes she was still only partially aware of, at this bridge on this night carrying soup. Was it worth it? She asked. Not the Empire. Not the trial. She didn't need to specify, and he knew she didn't. Was it worth it? The night, the decision, the 17 rooms, and the one lock on the inside door, and everything that came after. He looked at her for a moment, the length of a breath. Ask me something harder, he said. She almost smiled. It was something she'd inherited from him, the almost smile, the thing that happened in the neighborhood of the expression without fully committing to it, and she'd been doing it for so long it had become her own. They drove back through Velmore with the heat on and the radio off. The city went by outside the windows, lit and indifferent and full of the specific nighttime life of a place that never entirely sleeps, and she looked at it and thought about nothing in particular. Just looked, just let the city be what it was. Kieran drove. He almost never drove himself anywhere anymore. He drove tonight. At the turn onto Aldrich Hill, he said, without looking away from the road, "You should have a key." She looked at him. "To the house," he said. "You don't have one." I realized. A pause. "You should have one." She looked back at the road. "Okay," she said. The car pulled up the gravel drive. The house sat back from the gate with lights on in 2 windows, the kitchen and the back room on the 2nd floor. 3 rooms, same as always. The rest of the house exhaled around them in the dark. She got out. He got out. They walked to the front door together, not speaking, and he unlocked it and stepped aside, and she walked through and the house closed around them both, quiet and large and considerably warmer than the underside of a bridge in winter, which was, after everything, the only comparison that had ever really mattered. The bowl on the side table in the entryway held nothing. It always had. It always would. She had put it there the first week after the trial. She hadn't explained it to Kieran, and he hadn't asked. He'd looked at it once, on the day she placed it, and then he'd looked at her, and something moved between them in the silence that settled every remaining question without either of them having to say a word. She went upstairs. The room at the end of the corridor was the same room it had always been. The window still looked out over the back garden. The radiator still worked. The bolt on the inside of the door was still exactly where it had been on the first night. A simple brass thing, nothing dramatic. She didn't slide it across. She hadn't for years. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her, the specific sounds of a building that has learned to hold people in it, the creaks and the radiator's warmth and the very faint sound of the kitchen below, where she could hear Kieran putting a cup on the counter with his particular deliberate care, the sound of a man who has learned, late in life and not without cost, that the things worth protecting are worth being careful with. She closed her eyes. Outside, Velmore moved through its winter night, indifferent and lit, and full of people doing the complex private work of surviving their particular circumstances. Somewhere in the city, in a converted building on the south side with 40 beds and a kitchen and a bowl in the entryway that held nothing, a door opened for someone who needed it to open. Somewhere along the river, under a bridge the city had decided not to see, a child was doing the specific arithmetic of a cold night, calculating what was available and what was needed, and how wide the gap between them was. The gap was always there. It didn't close. You just worked at it, night by night, bowl by bowl, one open door at a time, with whatever you had and whoever had chosen to stand beside you, and you kept working because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was the one choice that had never once been available to anyone who'd ever sat beneath the Dunmore Bridge and looked up at the city's lights and decided, despite everything, to still be there in the morning. Elena Cross was 23 years old. She had a room with a bolt she no longer needed and a key she hadn't received yet, and a notebook full of plans that would take the rest of her life to complete. She thought that sounded about right. She slept.